Hello, and welcome to Riff Tear, a subsidiary of Diatonic Dissection. As I am chronically unemployed, I need to keep busy, otherwise I will rot. I realised in addition to my other ventures like trying to find a job, streaming,
Where the fuck am I?
chunkblower with a 0, over on Twitch where I am a rainbow puking unicorn PNG tuber, trying to be a professional music composer, managing socials, while trying to figure out cold fusion using the contents of a fruit bowl. I need to do more with this YouTube channel. So, in addition to the relatively newly started Sonic series, link up in the corner to the first video, I'm going to chase the algorithm a bit more aggressively, and so here we are with Doom: The Dark Ages. Now, before we get into the track, all the usual YouTube stuff like comment, subscribe, set fire to money in the name of the algorithm gods, whatever. Also, if you would like the sheet music / tabs for this, especially if you're not using a 9-string, you can get them all for free over at the Patreon, patreon.com/Diatonic Dissection. There's a link down below to save you having to spell it out correctly. Obviously, the soundtracks for Doom Eternal and Doom 2016 are well beloved, but with the controversy over the time composing for Eternal, Mick Gordon did not return for the Dark Ages. As a result, the soundtrack was composed by Finishing Move Inc., a group founded by Brian Lee White and Brian Trifon. I think they did a great job with the soundtrack, and given the game is a much more primal affair, it's reflected in the music with fewer synths, more straight up riffs, and even some orchestral stuff. The Dark Ages soundtrack even has blast beats. I want these videos to be for musicians and non-musicians alike, so the only way I could describe blast beats is imagine the sound of a drum kit falling down a staircase very quickly, but in time. There are various types of blast beats, but I'll explain them when we get to them. Now, there is a critical element to this soundtrack which I need to address, and that is the issue of the number of strings that your guitar has. I've used a 9-string for these videos and my transcriptions, but I understand that not everybody has either the good fortune or sheer stupidity to own such an instrument. With this in mind, I've also done transcriptions for 6 through 8 strings. Tunings are here on screen. To save having to film every type of guitar, this video was filmed using my 9-string, which is an Ibanez RG90 BKP. However, if you do want the filming on other guitars, let me know and I can get it sorted. Another important part of the soundtrack to raise is synths. I do not know very much about modular synths, but I am learning. I will try and explain these things to the best of my ability, but for the moment it will be primarily guitar and drums. That being said, I have transcribed some of the synth parts for guitar so you can play them if you want to. As you may have guessed, using a 9-string kind of removes the need for a bassist, so I haven't done any transcriptions for that. You can figure it out on your own if you're that desperate. One quick final note about the drums: they will sound very different from in my other videos, and that's because I realised that my regular drum sounds don't really match the production, so I recorded the MIDI and put it through the Oderholm drums plugin, and this kit is chunky. So the drums go from this to this. The sensitivity of the triggers on the kit was very high, so some of the clips may sound a bit funny even after editing. I've also included a foot cam so you can see what my feet are doing in the more complicated sections as I use double strokes. I play in socks, so you're not getting any grippers for free. I see you right there. Also, the footage is slightly dark because I am not aware of the power of shadows. Now, with all that admin aside, let's get started. The tempo is 110 BPM and the key is F sharp minor. However, I think that the track is written in a G sharp Locrian mode, which is a weird one. The Locrian being the regular minor scale with a flattened 2nd and 5th degree. Now, let's get started. Section A, there isn't an awful lot happening, but here is one of the synth parts transcribed for guitar. There is a small guitar motif that appears throughout the track, but first appears in Section A. It's a G sharp minor arpeggio, and it sounds slightly out of place because if we were sticking in the key, it should be a G sharp diminished arpeggio, as it is the second chord of the minor key. Now, on to section B, where we actually get some proper guitar parts. The section starts out with a riff that appears later in the soundtrack on the track Unchained Predator, which you will have heard because it was the music over the initial trailers for the game. Section C is where we get the first main riff for From the Ashes, and like much of the soundtrack, it is thick. With the guitars, you start on the G sharp, and after a semitone twiddle in the octave above, you then use the motif from earlier, the G sharp minor arpeggio, to move down to the D natural. Slight side tangent, this is a flattened fifth interval which is known as a tritone, also as the Devil's Interval, and unfortunately, no, it was not banned by the Catholic Church, as has been claimed by people ranging from comedian Bill Bailey
the Devil's Interval
through to Chris Barnes, former frontman of Cannibal Corpse.
Tritone, that's the devil's note. Like in the old days, you weren't allowed to use that note.
Adam Neely, famed jazz bassist and YouTuber, made a whole video explaining the history of it and how the harmony was avoided in medieval choral music because they were hard to keep in tune. The phrase "mi contra fa es diabolus in musica" was taken by scholars to literally be a warning about the devil, rather than its actual meaning of "me against fa is the devil in music," referring to the tritone. So basically, "me against fa" sounds bad, avoid if possible. But the popular interpretation has become the standard, as it is far more exciting than a rule relating to musical composition. Now, with that particular rant over, here is the riff. The drums finally get to do something. Rhythmically, you're following the main riff with a couple of little flourishes on the bass drum. Quick note, while I'm editing the video, I realised I forgot to talk about the jazz reimagining of the main riff for this track. So here it is, along with a shoddy editing of the famous movie Casablanca. Enjoy. The guitars for section D are a variation of the main riff, but when the drums kick in, it suddenly becomes much more of a thrash thing with fast chords and octave slides. Drummers, you get to have even more fun with the tried and tested thrash and early death metal approved skank beat. With the production being so dense, it's difficult to figure out exactly what the leading hand is doing. In my opinion, the downbeat on every eighth note feels far more cohesive rhythmically, and offbeat feels faster, as it's often used in metalcore by bands like August Burns Red. I've kept it simple and just gone with the downbeat version on the China at first, and then switching over to the every eighth note version after 4 bars on the ride cymbal. The fill at the end, as far as I can tell, again, dense production, is a linear pattern broken up between the hands and feet, going 4 in the hands, 2 in the feet, 4 in the hands, 2 in the feet, 2 in the hands and 2 in the feet, and then finish on the snare with a flab, which is both hands slightly out of unison to give 2 very close together notes. Here is the fill broken down. Section E is a variation on the riffs from section D with slightly different drums. We also have a return of the little motif for good measure. The drums are very simple for section E, your standard beginner's double kick part, but that doesn't mean that it's easy, as you have to keep it steady. We have something a bit different now in section F with the guitars, as it features some actual quick string skipping / octave jumping for the third bar of each repeat and some chromatics thrown in for good measure. Also, be careful of the bend in the second bar as it's only half a tone. For the drums, it is another standard metal drum part, but you do have a return of the 30-second note flourishes on the kick. I changed the main symbol of this to a splash, as I think that's what's being played in the production. Again, it's very dense, so some of the finer details are harder to parse out. Plus, we get to pretend to be Chris Adler, formerly of Lamb of God, and who doesn't want to do that? Section G is entirely synth stuff, so there is nothing I have to add here. So here is a small clip of me laughing maniacally at the Railspike ragdolling effect, and demons following me angrily because I've blown their arms off.
Oh, you...
Now, into section F. We've had our fun pulling limbs off demons like a child who's destined to be a serial killer tearing the wings off insects, but we need to get back to the music. The section starts off slow and then becomes marginally quicker with some properly sludgy guitar work, mainly riding around the lowest string and feeling the sadness of all the bassists around. There's a little tritone thrown in here for variety as well. The drums are doing some heavy stuff, but it's not particularly exciting, I'm afraid. Section I sees some interesting stuff as we have some rhythmic emphasis with both drums and guitar, but also what I think is a muted guitar essentially playing a drum part. Here is the main guitar part playing with the bass drum. The muted guitar is playing pretty quickly, as well as including the tritone ending from the previous section. This is possibly the best section for drums, as you get to do some really interesting stuff with your feet. Section J sees the introduction of a new riff. You start out with held chords and then riff away with some single note stuff and moving chords just to make it extra crunchy. The extra guitar is doing something that I like to refer to as the Djent siren. It involves playing two notes that are a semitone apart on two different strings and letting them ring out. It sounds horrible, but I love it. I used it many years ago on a terrible idea, which was a Djent version of We Are Number One, for those of you who can remember the meme. Because I have nothing but time on my hands, I re-recorded it with the current setup. Now that you have experienced the siren, here it is in the context of the track. the drums are now doing some blast beats. Thankfully, not to the ridiculous speeds we see nowadays from bands like Flesh God Apocalypse and Archspire, but more reasonable speeds like Killswitch Engage. The blast beat is also the same one that's used in the Killswitch Engage song, just not as fast. 16th notes on the snare with 8th notes on the hi-hat and bass drum. Here is the blast beat with the section. Into section K now, and we are on the home straight, and it returns us to the original opening riff. Much like the guitar, the drums are doing the same thing. Section L. We are now at the final section. The guitars are playing some power chords that move around and first involve a jump of a tenth and descend down. It's not too difficult a part, but it's essentially a marathon compared to what you've had to do so far. towards the end, we have the return of the Djent siren with a slight variation at the end. Thankfully, there are no more 30-second note flourishes for the drums for the ending, just some more standard metal beats that you need to keep steady. And that's it. We have successfully stretched 6 minutes of music into God knows how long of a video. All of the sheet music and tabs can be found over at the Patreon page for free, patreon.com/Diatonic Dissection. There's a link down below saving you having to type it and spell it correctly. All the usual YouTube stuff, like, share, comment, subscribe if you like, whatever. I hope that you enjoyed this video and found it somewhat informative if you are still around, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!